Get ready to be inspired by the great things happening in rural education. The Rural Scoop will bring you new ideas and innovative solutions. We'll dive into education issues and we'll highlight what's working in your rural communities. You'll hear from a variety of educators, administrators, professionals, and others who will provide relevant and engaging content in each episode. And now, serving up the scoop, here's your host, Dr. Melissa Sadorf.
Well, welcome back to the Rural Scoop, the show where we explore the people, policies, and possibilities shaping rural education across the country. I'm your host, Dr. Melissa Sadorf, Executive Director of the National Rural Education Association. And in today's episode, we're diving into a topic that sits at the intersection of identity, opportunity, and place, and that's college access for rural students, especially our first-gen students. These are students who often are celebrated for making it or making it out, but they're rarely asked what it costs them to get there. My guest today is a return guest. I'm so glad to have her back, Dr. Tieken, a leading voice in rural education research and the author of a powerful new book called Educated Out: How Rural Students Navigate Elite Colleges and What It Costs Them. And in this deeply human study, Mara follows 9 rural first-generation students as they enroll in and move through an elite liberal arts college that she calls Hilltop. And I love that name. Their stories raise some important questions, like what does success mean when it pulls you away from home? What are the hidden tolls that college takes on rural identity? And what do these journeys really reveal about the systems that students are expected to navigate? So whether you're a school leader or a policymaker or a rural advocate, I'm hoping that this conversation is really going to challenge the way that you think about higher education and about home in our rural community. So let's get right into it. Mara, welcome back. It's great to have you on the Scoop again.
Oh, it's so good to be here again, Melissa. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Well, I'm going to get started right away because I am really excited about the conversation around this new book. So I want to start, though, with your personal journey. How did you come to be interested in rural college access? And was there a turning point or a story that drew you into the work?
Yeah. Thanks for the question. So I began this work in about 2014 or so. And a couple of years before that, I had just started my job at Bates College, where I am currently an associate professor. So I had just started teaching there at Bates. And right at the end of my first year, so it was like May, I started getting graduation announcements in the mail. And these were announcements from my former third graders, back from when I had been teaching in rural Tennessee. So they were finally graduating from high school. And first, it's just so amazing to kind of come full circle and see, my kids, like these brilliant, wonderful, funny kids, actually, they're graduating now. And so, as they're, in the context of their announcements and on their posts on Facebook and everything, they shared a little bit about their plans and what they were doing. And so they were doing things like, they were becoming vet techs, they were, linemen, that sort of thing. And I was really struck that so few of them were going to college. There's maybe a handful of associate degree programs, very few going to four-year schools, and none of them going to this elite kind of college that I found myself at now. And so I really began to wonder why, why weren't they going? And I knew it wasn't because they didn't have the kind of academic, they didn't have the capacity or the capability, because they'd been my former third graders. I knew how brilliant and funny and wonderful and talented they were. And so I was curious, why aren't they going to college? And then after I'd spent a little more time at Bates, which is an elite, an elite arts college, my questions expanded a little bit, and I was still interested in why they hadn't gone. But I was also interested in, well, what if they had? Because Bates was, it's a pretty rarefied environment. When there's music spilling out from their dorm rooms, onto the quad, it's never country music. My students weren't talking about four-wheeling. No one seemed to buy clothes at Walmart. And so, I began to really think like, well, what if they had gone? Like, what would it have been like for them? How would they have experienced a place like Bates? And really, what would the costs have been? Like, what would it have meant for their relationships with family? Would they have been able to return home afterwards if they wanted to? And so this really led me to want to like dig deeper on that. And so, I began working on the study. I found 9 rural first-gen students at this elite school that I call Hilltop. And I followed them from the summer before enrollment all the way through to the fall after graduation. And they, just like my third graders, they were wonderful. They were great. I was so humbled to be able to spend 4 years of my life and their life with them as they went on this journey. But that's what led me to this work.
So let's talk a little bit about those students that you followed. For our listeners, how do you define rural and first generation in your research? And then how did those definitions shape the stories that you chose to follow? Because I'm sure there were a lot of things that you could have chosen to highlight.
Yes. So like you kind of highlighted, and I think most listeners probably know, there's not a million, but there's a lot of definitions of rural. Exactly. That I could have used. And the one I chose to use was the NCES locale codes for schools. So the National Center for Education Statistics gives every school a locale code, whether it's city, suburban, town, or rural. And I looked at where students would have gone to where students went to elementary school. And I chose elementary school rather than high school because, particularly in the Northeast, which is where Hilltop is located, there are many districts that don't have a local high school. And also I knew that maybe some rural kids might go to a private school. And so I kind of wanted to open myself up to that kind of variation. So I looked at locale codes for elementary schools. And that's how I operationalized rural. And then first generation, I used the definition on the Common Application, which means that neither parent has a 4-year degree. And so what I did in terms of selecting the students, I worked with the registrar at Hilltop. They gave me all of the students that would have been eligible. Then I wrote them a letter, invited them to participate. About half opted in. And so that's how I got this group of students. And they actually were over 2 class years. They were class of 2018 and 2019, and 9 students in total. One interesting thing about just even identifying the students was I quickly came to realize like how few rural first generation students go to Hilltop. And everyone had sort of said like, oh yeah, I'm sure we got plenty of students. We're kind of in a rural-ish, like even though Hilltop itself is in a small city, it's in a pretty rural state. And they're like, oh yeah, I'm sure we got plenty of students. And there really were not very many at all. And I actually think that's kind of indicative of many elite colleges. And I also think the fact that no one really knew is pretty interesting. We don't track our college students by rurality. And in many ways, that's really problematic because then it means we don't actually know who's at our school and then how they experience that. But you asked a little bit about how that shaped their journeys. I think one thing I will note is that the students came from a wide variety of both parental education levels. So all the way from parents, in a couple cases, the parents had associate's degrees, into, on the other end of the spectrum, parents having no formal education past 8th grade. And then in terms of rural, that also really varied. So some, old mill towns, some old farming communities, some kind of bedroom, like kind of more, probably in a couple years, it might be more suburban. And then a number of tourist towns. But what was interesting was across all of these, there were places that do not have many jobs for college graduates. And so that very much shaped how the students thought about college education, how their parents thought about college education, and then what it meant for them afterwards in terms of, they got this degree, they can't go home. And, I think that's actually true for many rural students, is that, and this leads to the title of my book, college becomes an education out. And that is a really high cost, both for the students themselves and for their families and communities. And so I talk a lot about okay, how can we actually shift that? How can we change that? So that, if kids are going to college, that they could return home if they wanted to be able to use that degree or go to any other rural place.
Mm. That's powerful. You focus on students that are attending an elite liberal arts college. So my question is, why did you choose that context? And do you think that your findings are unique to that type of elite institution, or do they reflect challenges found just across higher education in general?
Yeah, so I chose an elite college because, there's this real pretty pervasive narrative that rural kids don't go to college, and they they are going to college at lower rates than non-rural kids. So there's maybe a grain of truth there, but I do think the kind of narrative is perhaps a little bit stronger than the findings themselves. And we also know that rural kids don't go to college; they go to bachelor's degree programs in elite colleges at even lower rates. So I was interested in kind of like what can the most outlying students then actually tell us about this entire structure of educational inequity, college opportunity. And so I meaningfully chose kind of the most the outliers. So I could really think about what are their experiences, how do they navigate this, and what kind of light can that shed across this entire structure of higher education and the this opportunity structure. So in terms of how much of my findings are specific to elite education, certainly some are. In an elite environment, there's a real culture of wealth that very powerfully shapes the social scene and also in some ways the academic scene. And I can talk a little bit more about that, or at least the availability of academic opportunities. And so the students really had to navigate that. And so I think some of that might be pretty specific to elite education. They also were attending Hilltop, and many of their classmates had attended elite boarding schools. So that was also pretty different for them. And that might not generalize to other contexts. But I do think many of the findings resonate regardless of what kind of institution of higher education you're thinking about. All colleges, whether 2-year or 4-year, regardless of the level of eliteness or selectivity, they're all degree granting institutions. And so for that reason, they are all sites where we are negotiating things like social mobility and questions of belongingness, which are, two of the most salient things that these students really navigated. And so I think what I really hope is that people just don't sort of put this aside as this only being specific to students attending elite schools, because I think there is a lot here that is really salient across contexts.
Mara, in the first chapter, you describe this growing national interest in rural college access. And I've seen that. I've had many guests on the show that talk about rural college access. But there's also some real tension about whether rural students should go to college at all. And so what do you think is fueling that conversation right now? And how do you make sense out of those competing narratives that show up?
Yeah. So when I began the study in 2014, it was this real intense moment of college skepticism. There were all these editorials and articles that were being written that were really questioning whether a degree was worth it. There were some important questions that were being raised. So tuition was climbing, debt was rising, and we also know that rural students take on a disproportionate amount of debt. So that's a particularly salient rural question. And many graduates were really struggling to find work. And so elite schools in particular were receiving a lot of this attention, this really negative attention. And then 2016 happened, and Trump was elected. And there was this kind of narrative that rural America was really responsible for his election. And so rural America, and particularly rural education, came under a lot of scrutiny. And so this led to this real push to get rural kids to college. But I've kind of got issues with both sides of this debate. So the college critics, who are saying that degrees aren't necessary and that elite credentials shouldn't matter. And to be clear, I'm not sure elite credentials should matter as much as they do. But the folks that are really questioning whether a degree is necessary, it's kind of packaged in this populist rhetoric. But what it serves to do is it actually functions to exclude, right? So many of the college critics are first saying they are college graduates themselves. So they are benefiting, right, from having had it, or for having that degree. And what all that questioning does is it actually just ends up keeping kids out of college. So it makes it that much more exclusionary and protects the degree that much more. And, I think it's really important to recognize that there's actually an economic incentive to have kids not go to college, because a large part of the American economy depends on low-wage work. And so one way you can ensure that you've got that workforce is to keep kids out of college, right?
Yep.
And many rural communities are particularly exploited when it comes to this. There is much low-wage work that happens in rural communities, whether it's picking strawberries or, changing sheets at the resort or coal mining or whatever it is, like jobs that are super necessary. And I don't want to downplay the importance of this work, but it's low wage. And so if we keep kids from going to college, we ensure that we have that necessary base of workers, right? So I think part of the college critique, there's actually some of that maybe happening too, right? There's this economic incentive to ensuring kids don't go to college. But the get kids to college argument, I think, is also problematic, but differently so. I think a lot of it came out of the wake of Trump's first election. And many liberals in particular landed on this uneducated rural voter trope, this idea that it was the uneducated rural voter that elected Trump. So what are we going to do about that? We will educate them. And so, I think if we're being really honest, I think there's at least some piece of this get rural kids to college argument that is all about getting, changing the rural voter and getting them to quote unquote vote right. And so I think both sides, there's some self-interest there. And so that debate, I think really, it also feels very far removed from the kids themselves that are trying to negotiate all of this. They're the ones, this is not some sort of theoretical, political, or economic argument. This is about them, their lives, their families' lives. And I mean, the way I feel is that college should be an option. I do not think that every kid should go to college, urban or rural or whoever. But I think it needs to be a choice that they have, a meaningful choice that they can make. I think when we foreclose options before that, that is what to me feels deeply inequitable. So I believe it needs to be an option, and also that option shouldn't be so costly for the kids that do go.
Speaking of that cost, you paint a really vivid picture of what these students experienced once they got to Hilltop. Yeah. So what are those challenges, the most significant ones that they faced? Because I'm sure there are quite a few. And how do those tie back to their rural roots?
Yeah. So even before they get to college, there's challenges, right? And so in terms of application admission, and so we know that rural areas have fewer guidance counselors, for example, to be able to get them to do that kind of intensive counseling. And not just get kids somewhere, but get kids to the right place for their own particular goals. We also know that there's fewer AP courses in rural areas. Extracurriculars might be more limited in more rural areas. And if you're applying to selective schools, then that kind of really matters. Also, all 9 of my students described very limited contact with college admissions officials. And if you think about it from the admissions side, the admissions officers want to go to the place where they're going to get the maximum bang for their buck. So they're not going to go to that tiny rural public school that requires, 2 flights and then a 4-hour drive, because that's just an inefficient use of their time, right?
Yeah.
But what that means, of course, for the kids sitting in that school is that, again, there's kind of a selection of post-high school opportunities that are just never even on the plate, or on the table for them. And then also we know that education levels in general tend to be lower in rural areas. So that means we've got more first-generation families. And so those families are not able to provide the same level of counseling and coaching through the application process. So those are some of the challenges that are specific to just getting to college. Then when kids actually are there, first, a lot of the students experienced academic under-preparation. So they didn't feel like they had the same level of preparation, particularly for this group compared to their boarding school classmates. And also just because there's not as many AP courses in rural areas, they didn't have all that, the same level of college preparatory classrooms or coursework. Then, as I mentioned, there was a real culture of wealth. And so transitioning to that culture of wealth was really difficult. And this was both social. So, as one student told me, you need to have the money to be able to participate, and whether that's like, go to the parties, go to the concerts, to wear the right clothes, all of those things that requires money. But even some of the academic opportunities require money. So like, some courses, you need the textbooks. You need to have there might be supplemental fees for materials, study abroad. Now, if you're on a high level of financial aid, study abroad might be covered. But if you're kind of in that middle area, you don't have the resources to be able to study abroad on your own, yet you don't get the assistance in order to be able to pursue it. So even a lot of the academic opportunities. Then for these students in particular, they experienced a lot of there are all these divides that started to arise between their family or their home and the Hilltop crowd or the Hilltop context. So there were certainly cultural and kind of wealth related divides there. But then also some of it was at home, one of the students or a couple of the students talked about how everything felt more practical. You could see how what you were learning, it really has this hands-on application. But then at Hilltop, everything felt very sort of academic, esoteric, wasn't sure what the real life application is. They often wondered, is this going to matter at all? One student described it as feeling he was stuck in neutral, between school, high school, and real life. Whereas his rural friends back home, they'd already gone on and started a rural life, or real life. And so they were having kids, they had real jobs, and he was just kind of, sort of floating out there. So there was this kind of divide between what was academic and what was seen as practical. Then they also needed to make money in order to be able to pay for their education, but that need to make money prevented them from doing other things like the more social stuff, or taking on the job shadow or the low paying but professionally important internship that would matter more, in the long term. And then they talked a lot about how their parents, with them not having gone to a 4-year school, their parents just didn't understand. And so they really struggled sometimes with feeling what I'm experiencing, I can't talk to my parents about it. And that often felt really isolating for them.
Very.
So that was some of the challenges that came with just, being at school. And then in terms of graduating, they didn't have the same level of connection, the professional connections and networks that their urban peers did. So they have the degree, but they don't have an uncle that works on Wall Street that can get them a job at, his firm.
Right.
And so they're struggling to get to that urban place. But they also can't go home because there's not as many jobs there, particularly for college graduates. And they're feeling a little bit of this cultural and political divide, with oftentimes political divide at home as well. And so they're kind of can't go home, also can't really go to an urban place. And I should be clear, some of them, they all assumed they would need to go to an urban place after graduation. Some of them deeply wanted that. Others, not really, but they just felt that's probably the only place they could get a job. And so but it was hard for them because they didn't have those kinds of contacts and everything. It was hard for them to get those jobs. And then they also, many of them had a lot of debt. And so, again, ultimately they're educated out of their rural homes. They can't return home, but there's this huge price to pay for a college degree. So a lot of these things are about, there's components of this that are also about wealth, that also be about race. But there's a deep part of this that's all about place and where the students are from. And I feel that component of college opportunity and college access is really overlooked as we talk about, this entire college inequality problem.
Mara, when you talk about those barriers to really participating fully in college life, whether the interns or internships or travel or even those network opportunities that they just don't have, what does that do to their sense of belonging? Because you mentioned belonging earlier on. Can you talk a little bit about how that showed up?
Yeah. it was really interesting. So beginning in their first year, and then a little bit more as time went on, they started to tell me, like, I'm afraid I don't belong at Hilltop. There's just something that feels like it's kind of off. Like, I feel sometimes like an outsider. I'm in the minority. I would hear them say this a lot. And I think it's because of just what you said, like they don't have full access to a college education. So they're there, but they don't always feel totally welcome. And they don't feel like, hey, my classmates can do all these other things. I can't do that. And so I'm here, but my belonging feels a little bit more provisional. And they, to be clear, they've really struggled with to name, why is it that I don't feel like I belong? They often tied it to being first gen or not having the same level of wealth. But I do think there's this component of place. Yet they didn't have the vocabulary really to talk about that. We talk about college opportunity and we link it to race and class, maybe not enough. But I think there's at least some awareness that race and class might mediate one's college experience. We don't talk about how place might. And so then when it's happening to them, they're not able to name that in the same way. And so they often internalize it. They blame themselves. I'm not smart enough, or there's something wrong with me. And so I think we really need to kind of shift, again, how we talk about it, both so we can expand opportunity, but also so students can make sense of their own experiences and realize, hey, this isn't about me. This is about the opportunity structure and, that I'm navigating right now, right? Mm-hmm. And so, I think there's we need to shift that narrative, give kids that vocabulary so that they can see when it's happening, understand when it's happening, and then we can all begin to think about okay, how do we actually expand opportunity so they don't have as many of these challenges.
Nice. But it's not all bad, because you also highlight the assets that the students brought with them. I mean, those strengths that are really rooted in place. So what kinds of resources did you see that were embedded in their backgrounds, and how did that really help them to persist in their education?
Yeah. And so first thing I will highlight, they all did persist, right? So they all made it. They all got that degree. And, by the time that I did that last interview with them in the fall after graduation, they were all working. They were, so they succeeded. And I really want to make sure that I highlight that, because rural kids can do phenomenally well at elite colleges. The problem was the cost for them, right? But you asked about resources. So the first thing, there were many resources. One was family, of course. Their family had really high expectations for them. Their parents were the reason they got to an elite school. They all, well, with one exception, they all wanted their kids to go to college. They thought their kids were capable of going to an elite school. They very much supported those hopes and those dreams. And routinely, they were a source of emotional support for the students. So when, the students would tell me all the time how, they would call home. And even if their parents didn't understand the nitty gritty, just their faith in their kids meant so much to the students. They also just, home itself was a refuge, and that was often a word the students would use. When things got too much, they would go home. And they lived, so 2 of the students, Hilltop is in New England. 2 of the students were from out west. The other 7 were from New England as well. And so for the 7 that were, relatively close by, they went home quite consistently. Actually, in ways I thought were very healthy and productive. So when Hilltop became too much, they would just go home. It's just home was a sanctuary itself. But they also described the rural environment being really important. Just being able to go outside, be still in the woods or on the water or in the mountains or whatever it was. That was a sanctuary. And then they also talked a lot about how their rurality gave them a sense of grit and determination. That is really what fueled them and what got them through. They were all rural kids who were not expected to go to college. And maybe they had individual teachers who might have expected them to go or hoped they would go. But again, sort of the national narrative is that rural kids don't go to college. They certainly don't go to elite schools. And these kids did. And they entered Hilltop with this real desire to prove everyone wrong. And that fueled them, that kept them going. And so, and I think just that kind of like rural grittiness was, was really critical to them doing well. And, I've got a little bit of a problem with the whole grit narrative. Like, I wish we talked more about why kids need grit rather than, and the conditions that require grit rather than the grittiness itself. But that said, like, I think that was in large part what fueled them.
Interesting. And throughout the book, there's a theme that's pretty heartbreaking, that rural students often face a very painful decision of college or community.
Yeah.
And can you talk a little bit more about that choice and how the students that you followed try to reconcile it?
Yeah. So I think in a whole variety of ways, we kind of tell rural kids they've got to make the choice. So they can either, after high school, they can either stay in their rural community, don't go to college, but they can retain all those friendships and relationships, but maybe lose the chance for upward mobility. Or they can go to college, get that chance for upward mobility, but lose all the relationships and community. And it's kind of seen as a fork in the road, like those are the two choices. And research has shown how like that's painful for rural kids. That causes a lot of anxiety, a lot of stress. And it's also something we're not asking of our urban and suburban kids, right? Because they often can go home afterwards. But like on the shoulder of 11th and 12th graders, we're placing this pretty awful choice, right?
Right.
And on their families too. And so, I've got to say for the students, my 9 students, I think part of the way they made it was by never feeling like it was a choice. They were trying desperately to hold on to both. They were going to college, but they were trying to keep those relationships with home. But I think just how much they struggled to do that just underscores the fact of the choice. And so, I think what we need to think about is how do we make that not be a choice that rural students have to make? And to be very clear, I'm not saying, okay, we'll just, not send any kids to, college. I'm saying we need to make it so that the kids that want to go to college can, and then they can return and have that be a viable option for them so that they're not faced with this, like, again, this terrible sort of dichotomy at age, 17?
Mm-hmm. Sure. And by chapter 6, I mean, the title of the book is Educated Out. And you describe that students really get caught between two worlds or feeling like they're caught between two worlds where either they're too far removed to return home easily, but they're really not fully anchored in those elite professional spaces either. And so, after they've gone through a graduate program or they've gotten the degree, what kind of impact does that liminal identity mean for those rural graduates?
That's a really good question. I think I saw it sort of playing out in a variety of ways. I think some students really struggled. They felt very isolated in that kind of like, liminal spaces can be really like lonely spaces, right? Mm-hmm. And they really struggled because they felt like they didn't belong in either place. And, some of them, they all experience kind of moments of loneliness and isolation while on Hilltop's campus and certainly in the transition out. But for some of them, it was much more persistent. And so, for a couple of students, what it led to was they pursued the elite job in the urban environment, ended up hating it. And I just know, I'm in touch with most of them now. And, now they're trying to figure out like, well, can I come back? How do I make that work? What does that look like? One in particular used the word, he feels like he's floating. He's kind of untethered to either space. I think for like another group of the students, they actually began to feel like being able to live in both worlds was a real strength. And so they learned how to code switch. They learned how to boundary cross. And this is a skill that actually is now quite valuable post-graduation. And And so, yes, the degree was costly, and, financially, but also in all kinds of other ways. But they appreciate the ways in which they learned how to do all of that work, right? So I think it's very much a part of their identity now, in terms of like this feeling of betwixt and between. For some, I think learning the skills to do that really feels very empowering to them. For others, I think they are still feeling pretty betwixt and between.
It'll be interesting to see if they keep in contact with you over the next 5 or 10 years. How does that change, and where does it show up in their life?
So, yeah, absolutely. And it's really interesting, again, like, because they graduated in 2018 and 2019. So, they are a few years out now, and I can see how that is sort of shaping their professional identities, their personal identities, how they're navigating. But again, also some of the costs, yeah.
You push back in the book on the narrative that rural parents are barriers to their students going to college. So what did your research really show about the actual role that families play? Because you mentioned that, supportive and loving and very grounding for them. But and additionally, how might schools, especially those in rural communities, reframe their engagement with parents and caregivers around college going?
Yeah, so I think this is a really, really important point. So first, I will admit, I've got a select group of parents. Like, I chose these students after they'd already committed to Hilltop. So, I'm getting the ones that are going, right? But that said, I was still really surprised by how supportive the parents were. These kids were going to Hilltop because of their parents, not in spite of their parents. There was one parent that was not on board. All of the other ones were, though. And so... rural parents were not the barrier here. They were actually the asset. They were the resource that got the kids to college. And really what it came down for parents was they had struggled economically, throughout their life because they didn't have a degree. And so they wanted something different for their kids. And so, they talked to their kids in very real ways about, like, we were on welfare. We, yes, I've had a job, but I've always hated it. I want something different for you. And so I want you to go to Hilltop, so you can have all, I'm giving you as many opportunities as possible, right? And they also really thought about liberal arts pretty interestingly. I kind of thought maybe they'd be a little more skeptical of the liberal arts. And there were moments of skepticism, surely. I had one parent tell me, like, after his kid took an art class, was like, I'm not paying, $50,000 for, and it was laced with a few expletives, but, like, I'm not paying $50,000 for him to take this art class. But the reason they wanted him to go to liberal arts college is, like, their kids they weren't sure they knew what they wanted to do. And so they wanted them to have, like, be able to experience kind of all the options, so that they can actually make an informed choice about, a professional path going forward. So, I really think we should start to think about how we can actually think about parents as assets in this college-going process. And to be clear, I think what would be most helpful for rural high school teachers, guidance counselors, administrators to be thinking about is, well, where are the knowledge gaps? Because the parents, they were very much on board with their kids going to college. They didn't always know how to get them there. So what's the very concrete knowledge that schools can help provide that will allow parents to be the best advocates and resources that they can possibly be? And I think this also comes from, like, you need to have the trusting relationships. And so, for a year before I began the study, I did a lot of interviews with rural school counselors. And I heard all kinds of things about parents. And what it really came down to, what I saw was that it was the counselors and the school administrators that had trusting relationships with parents, that then they were able to see the parents as assets. The parents would confide in them, like, hey, I have no idea how to fill out this FAFSA. And the school would be able to sit down with them and say, oh, you do this, then you do this, then you do this. If there's not that relationship of trust, The parent is not going to know what to do, and how to help their kid. The school is going to read that as this parent is disinterested, or this parent is the challenge, this parent is the barrier. And then they're going to perpetuate this sort of narrative that just pushes the parent even further away, and the kid's not going to college. So I think really it first means build those strong relationships with parents, so parents do feel like they can go to the school, get the support they need. And then that's a much more, that positions the student in a very different kind of place than, if they don't have that. And a lot of schools now are doing more around, the early college visits and all of those things. And I think those are great. I think you've got to be really careful about how we frame those to parents, because if parents feel like that's coming from a place of paternalism, they're going to immediately shut down. Yeah. So I think it really needs to be school staff and families need to be thinking about one another or able to think about one another as allies in this process. And again, not with any sort of predetermined outcome, but what we need to do for all of our rural kids is help them understand the entire vast array of opportunities, so we can pick one that matches, your strengths and your goals, without, again, taking off options before the kid is even able to, really make an informed choice.
Yeah. Mara, I want to circle back to something that you talked a little bit about when we first started out, and that was that after 2016, especially after that, that rural students experienced this political and cultural isolation on campus. And so can you talk a little bit about how the students that you followed navigated being stereotyped or misunderstood from where they came from?
Yep. And so you named it exactly right there. So first thing, the students, I would say, just to put this out there, the students were all over the map politically. So, again, there's this rural narrative that says that all rural voters vote Trump. That was certainly not the case of the students or of their parents. And so there's a lot of political diversity. And I think that in and of itself is just important to name, because that flies in the face of assumption oftentimes. But in terms of, first let's just say a little bit about how it showed up. Because, there was this national narrative that rural America, often uneducated, possibly racist voters, elected Trump. And so students heard that. They also, in some of their classes, experienced professors saying, and I know they heard it from classmates too, but, even professors would say things like, there was one in particular that said, the student described going to class the day after the election, and there was kind of a moment of silence at the beginning of class. And the professor said, I don't know how academia could let this happen, to let basically rural America vote Trump. And the student was just like, oh my gosh, one, is that academia's job? But two, how out of touch? Of course, yes, academia is completely out of touch with rural America. Why would we think otherwise? And so for him, it just it really highlighted the paternalism that was present. And I think the students really struggled with that. They acknowledged that, many of them came from more conservative areas, and they saw all the, many of their neighbors were voting Trump, and some of their parents. And so, on the one hand, they saw some of it, it felt like there was something there, right? Some of the national narrative was actually accurate. But then at the same time, they also really questioned this, I feel like there's more to it than just rural America voted in Trump and all of rural America is uneducated and possibly racist. And they're like, that narrative just doesn't describe where I'm from and in my hometown and the people I love. And so for many of them, it crystallized a moment where they began to think a little bit more about belonging on campus and feeling like, maybe I don't belong here. My parents, my community definitely don't belong here. And so I think it really highlighted some of the divide they were feeling. And many of them really felt torn. They didn't know how to make sense of it, again, because we don't really have this language around placism and place bias. And so they, some of the ones that were a little more critical were kind of one student in particular was like, can't you people do the math? like rural America, there's not enough people in rural America to have voted in Trump. Like that is just not like factually accurate. It's like the Greenwich Connecticut's of the world that got Trump elected. So, some of them were able to like kind of think a little bit more critically about it, but a lot of them were just sort of like, there might be some parts of this that are right, but like the kind of like whole paternalism thing, I don't know about, but then some of also them were participating in some ways. Like one student told me, he was like, and he was being very, very honest. One of the students was being very honest, and he was like, sometimes I look down on people a little bit now. I'm thinking like I went to an elite college. I know what's going on. I sort of know better. So they were, I talked to them a lot. And so we had this conversation a lot, but they really struggled to kind of figure out like, why do I feel like I don't belong here? How do politics and Trump fit into this mix? How does where I'm from matter or not matter in this whole equation?
Okay. Kind of along those same lines, one of the most powerful lines in Educated Out reads, and I'm going to read it so I don't get it wrong. College, these rural students learned, is not just about merit. It's about money. It's about race. It's about your parents' education. And although it's not often talked about, college is also about where you're from. So along those same lines, can you unpack that? And how does that influence and impact that issue of rurality operating as an invisible social marker, a powerful social marker, but something that's invisible?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's exactly it. And by we, I mean like maybe policymakers, researchers, practitioners. I think we understand, perhaps not enough, and perhaps don't do enough about it, but I think we understand in some basic way that class and that race really shape students' college access and college experience. Mm-hmm. What we don't often talk about is how geography and rurality in particular shape access and opportunity. And what I learned from these 9 students is it does in all kinds of ways, even if the students themselves can't always see it. And so there's, like this idea that college is about merit, and getting into college is about merit, and being successful about college is merit, but it's also dependent on all these other factors, and place is a really powerful one of those that we don't actually talk about and think about enough.
One of the things that you talk about that I really love, this idea is that college attendance is seen as an act of resistance. Just a refusal to stay in devalued rural labor despite the odds, which you've mentioned before. They're low-paying jobs. So how did the students that you worked with see themselves in that role? And what did it teach you about the complexity of rural aspiration?
That's a really good question. So I think they did see themselves as resistors in all kinds of ways. They said, like, no one expects me to be here, right? And so I'm proving everybody wrong. One student talked about how he got into Hilltop, and he went and told his math teacher, and she laughed because she just didn't think that there's any way he could have gotten into Hilltop. Other students said, rural students aren't expected to go on, and the word he used an interesting word. He said, rural students are not expected to go on and exceed. And I'm proving them wrong. So they really thought, like, and this is part of that, like, I mentioned before, like, there's this kind of stay or go choice that rural students are presented with. And one way that they tried to have both was like, they're going to go, but by going, they're going to show all the other rural kids that they can go too. Yeah. So they're still remaining attached to community even by going, right? Because what they're doing is they're doing a service for all of those kids back home. So for them, going to college was an act of resistance. No one's expecting me to go, right? And that's not to that's not to devalue rural economies or professions or anything like that. But they wanted to speak back to the opportunity structure that expects them, simply because they're rural, not to go to college and not to succeed at college. And by going and by succeeding, they're able to tell everybody that, like, hey, that rural stereotype you have is just wrong.
That's fantastic. So let's talk about impact.
Yeah.
In writing this book, what do you hope that school leaders or policymakers or rural advocates, what do you want them to take away from Educated Out? And how can we, moving beyond that, build systems that recognize both the aspirations and the attachments that rural students carry with them?
Yeah. So I think, for K-12 practitioners, I think one thing we need to really think about is how to strengthen advising so that kids do understand all of their options, all of the opportunities that exist out there, and also how to pay for them. And so part of the nitty gritty of this might actually be better preparation for rural guidance counselors, because rural guidance counselors are often they are basically the vice principal. They are also, maybe actually teaching math class too. They're the ones, plunging the toilet when it gets clogged, like they're doing everything. And so to just simply add on, they need to actually better understand this really complex and changing college landscape, that is a huge ask. So we need to also think about how do we provide that preparation, how do we better compensate, all of those sorts of pieces there. I think also we need to be thinking about how to deal with some of that academic under preparation piece. To be really clear, I do not think that consolidation and closure is the issue, or is the answer here. You've heard me talk enough about that. Yeah. But I think about how do we, dual enrollment is something that's really taking off in many rural areas. So I think that might be a good pathway. And then also I think we need to think about high expectations for all kids. And this goes back a little bit to how do we also interact with families and parents? How do we also have high expectations for families and parents as well? And then in terms of what this means for college practitioners, I think one big piece is in terms of admission, we think all about merit and what merit looks like. I think we need to understand that overcoming geographic barriers is also a part of merit, right? And so that's how merit might show up in more rural spaces. I think also working on that college admission and outreach piece. And so, So how do we make it so that admissions officers are showing up in more rural schools? Right. And certainly, technology can play a role there. But I do think that nothing really, there's nothing that can replace a in-person visit. And so how do we do some of that? And maybe having college consortia, would be a way to mitigate some of the geographic barriers. I also think about, we talk a lot about bias in curriculum. I think there's a real place-based bias in the curriculum. And how does that show up on college campuses? How do we confront that? I think also looking at stronger partnerships between community colleges and four-year colleges, so that for rural kids who do go to community colleges, how do we make that then it more possible for them to go on to get that four-year degree? And then how do we also think about better career counseling, building the networks in rural areas so that getting a job post-college graduation doesn't have to mean it has to be an urban job. Part of the problem here is that college career networks and the college, the college counseling or the career counseling centers in colleges are often very urban focused. So there might be jobs in rural places. I mean, there are jobs in rural places that do use college degrees. How do we make sure those are showing up on the radar of, the career counselors in colleges, so that they're actually presenting these opportunities and options back to students? But then I think actually the biggest piece here is really a policymaking piece, and it's how do we get jobs in rural areas that can use college degrees? And to be really clear, I think this is an important part of any sort of rural revitalization, package of policies. So many policymakers, they talk about, yes, we want to revitalize rural America, but they're not actually looking at what kinds of jobs are in rural places. How do we make sure that it's not just building the new, mega security prison, but it's also jobs that require college degrees, so we can have a really diverse economy, a more diverse economy in a rural area, which has all sorts of economic benefits, but then also can mean that kids can go get that degree and then come back home and use it there. So I think we really need to be coordinating our economic and our educational policy so that, like you said, there can be that return pathway that kids don't have to leave if they don't want to.
Yeah. Well said. Well said. Well, Mara, I want to thank you for joining us on the Rural Scoop today. Your research and especially your thoughtful storytelling in Educate It Out. And I hope everyone goes out and gets it. It is now out, and it is definitely worth the read. It really does bring clarity and heart to the lived experiences of rural students that are navigating spaces that too often just they overlook them. And so I am very grateful for your work, and I know that many others are as well. And I appreciate the chance to share this conversation with our listeners.
Thank you so much for inviting me here. As I mentioned, this is like the first time post-publication that I'm talking about the book. So it's really special to be able to do this here with you. I just, I'm so proud of and grateful for these students. Part of the reason they wanted to do this work was so that it wouldn't have to be as hard for other rural kids.
I love that.
And so, I'm just I feel so grateful they trusted me and that I can be kind of a messenger for their stories getting out there.
Well, thank you so much for telling the story. And for those of you that are tuning in, if today's episode gave you something to think about, and I hope that it did, please take a moment to, first of all, look up the book and make sure that you purchase. It's well worth the read. But like, subscribe, and leave a review here or wherever you listen to your podcast. And make sure that you share this episode with a colleague or a student or someone in your community who really does care about rural education and is looking maybe for their own student to go to experience a higher education institution of whether it's in a rural community or out of a rural community. And since Mara is a returning guest and didn't have to answer it today, I'm going to leave you with our signature question. So what is your rural advantage? We'll see you next time on the Rural Scoop.
Thanks so much for tuning in to the Rural Scoop. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to rate, review, and subscribe. Your support helps us keep these important rural conversations going. And we'd love to hear from you, so feel free to leave a comment or share your thoughts. You can follow along and never miss a new release by subscribing on your favorite podcast platform or by following us on social. We're on YouTube at The Rural Scoop, Instagram at msadorf1, and X at msadorf03. The Rural Scoop is produced with support from Vela Educational Consultants. To learn more, visit velaconsultants.com. See you next time for more great discussions about rural education. And as always, keep leaning in to the rural advantage.